Hello and welcome to our Season of Creation episodes of Prophetic Voices, Preaching and Teaching Beloved Community, a podcast from the Episcopal Church's Office of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care, where we explore the season and the lectionary through the lens of social justice. The Season of Creation is celebrated September 1st through October 4th by Christians around the world as a time for renewing, repairing, and restoring our relationship to God, one another, and all of creation. I'm your host, Reverend Shaniqua, Interim Indigenous Missioner, and I'm so glad you could join us. In this episode of Prophetic Voices, we'll be discussing the lectionary for Sunday, September 7th, Proper 18. Our amazing guests this week are the talented Phoebe Chatfield, who serves as the staff officer for creation care for the Episcopal Church Presiding Bishop's Office. She lives in Somerville, Massachusetts, and is committed to creating a world where all can thrive. The Reverend Canon Deborah Royals, who serves as the canon for Native American ministry in the Diocese of Arizona and is developing the Four Winds Indigenous new church community in Tucson. She is also piloting a chaplain position for the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. Debbie is Indigenous Pascua Yaqui, a registered nurse, a mom, a grandma, and is passionate about living out her call to serve the spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical wellness of all God's people. And last but not least, Canon Dr. David O'Hara, who is the canon for creation care for the Diocese of South Dakota. He is a professor of religion, philosophy, classics, and environmental studies, and the director of environmental studies and sustainability at Augustana University in Sioux Falls. He studies the diverse relationships between fish and forests, global water systems, and the way our beliefs take concrete form in the world we build. He loves sharing books, tea, and the great outdoors with others, and especially with his wife, the Reverend Dr. Christina O'Hara. Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for being willing to be guests on Prophetic Voices. I'm so excited that we have this wonderful season of creation episodes. And this year's theme is Peace with Creation. And I sort of thought you could interpret it as being at peace with creation, but also bringing peace through creation or by creation. What does peace with creation mean to you?
Well, if nobody else wants to jump in, I'll just say I've come to appreciate mosquitoes. I'm not saying I like them, but I have come to appreciate mosquitoes. I often hear people say, okay, I get that there's lots of beautiful things out there that God made, and those are the beautiful things that I recognize as beautiful, right? The flowers that I like, the trees that I like, the mountains that I like. But as I've been teaching about these things, teaching about environmental studies and sustainability and religion, I've started paying closer attention to some of the things that I don't like or that simply make me uncomfortable. And I've come to realize most mosquitoes in the world don't bite humans. And most of them are pollinators, and most of them are food for our siblings, like the fish and the dragonflies. They're our relatives, and they're part of the beauty of creation. I still don't like being bitten by them. I don't like it when they transmit diseases to my other relatives. But I've come to appreciate that there's stuff out there that I didn't necessarily like on my own terms, but that means that I need to understand better what the terms are that those things are in the world with.
I'm really glad you said that, Dave. I think what's important here is the balance, right? It's being at peace with creation is not working against it, but working with it, being in sort of sync with everything that happens in particular seasons, the kinds of things that are out there, the insects that are out there, the plants that are out there, the weather itself. That's being at peace with creation, not working against it, but with it.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I think part of what the season of creation invites us into is to reframing or rethinking our perspective, maybe yes, on mosquitoes.
Mm.
And one of the reframes that it offers us is this global perspective, because Christians all over the world participate in the season of creation. And I think this framework of peace for creation invites us to really think about the places around the world that are impacted by war and the connections between war and the environment and war and climate change, and to feel sort of a particular sense of solidarity and care with people impacted by war.
If your creation is new to creation care or the season of creation, what's an easy way to get started? And maybe what are some liturgical ideas?
Gosh, I think the easiest way to get in touch with creation is to do something in creation. I begin almost every creation season talking about the four sacred elements, talking about earth, air, fire, and water. Talking about how we are earth, air, fire, and water. We are indeed made up of the same things that come out of all of those sacred elements, and putting us in touch with that we are part of a system rather than apart from that system. This is a time when we do blessings of water. Oftentimes, I know that in the church system, there's the connection of Easter Vigil with the first fire, but I don't think that there's anything wrong with actually blessing fire and incorporating fire into people's spirituality as a way. Aside from that, I think getting people out into creation, doing something, planting trees, picking up garbage, whatever, all those kinds of things that we can tangibly do. It can be even as simple as going to a congregation and not drinking out of a styrofoam cup, but doing something a little bit more conscious and intentional.
I agree with that 100%. I think that's right. Go get your fingers dirty. Play in the dirt, plant something, clean something up, especially if it's not just something that you own, maybe something that needs to be cleaned up that other people don't have the strength or the energy or the time to clean. Maybe plant flowers in a place that others need them, or plant trees in places where they'll provide food for people, maybe even long after you're gone.
Yeah, I love that. Make it local and think about where in your community could be in need of that kind of care or healing. I also think it's a great opportunity to look at your congregation or your community and start where you're already strong, whether that's working with your children's program or your young adults, or if you have a food program, and use that as a place where you could learn or pray or act with that community. And if this would be your first time participating in the season of creation in your liturgy, in your worship, there's an amazing guide called the Celebration Guide for Episcopal Parishes for the season of creation. That's on the Episcopal Church website and we'll include in the show notes of this episode. And that has some beautiful ideas for prayers and other liturgical elements that you could add in during the season.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm really tickled that our Bishop Jennifer Redall here in the Diocese of Arizona has actually even approved a lot of those liturgical resources for the Sunday principal service, right? So it encourages people even further by her making a statement. Yeah.
Yeah, last year in 2024, 50 diocesan bishops, including Bishop Redall, approved the Season of Creation Celebration Guide, and we're hoping that even more bishops will do that this year.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen communities do, I saw a community in Scotland do this. It wasn't even a faith community, just an ordinary city. They did an invitation to the community. They asked, where do you feel most at home in our community? And where do you feel safest in our community? So this was a kind of celebration of the community. And they asked people to simply go out with their phones and take a picture. So that's something that children can do. Anyone can do if they've got access to a phone or to a camera. People could go out in groups if one person doesn't have one. But just you could walk around the inside of your worship space. You could walk around the outside as well and make it a moment of celebration. Then what they did is they took the photos and they printed some out and put them up on the wall and asked some people, some people are good at the photos. Some people are good at just describing it in words. And they asked people to write words about where they feel most at home, most safe, most included, most welcome. This is so basic and so simple, but they printed those out next to the photos as well. And now they had this space where people could walk by and say, oh yeah, I feel that there as well. And there's plenty that we could find where we say, I don't feel safe here. This doesn't work for me. But that was a really nice way to kind of welcome people into the community and say, hey, check this out. Did you know we have this little space here? And this is a place where you're welcome as well. It also invited people just to explore the place, maybe in ways that they hadn't done so before.
Awesome.
That's a cool idea.
Let's talk a little bit about the gospel, or maybe a lot about the gospel. This was kind of a rough one as I was reading it. You don't always hear Jesus use the word hate. And so it just raises a lot of questions. And I've seen it used to justify folks disowning their LGBT children, or folks who have a different religious belief, to disown their relatives that don't have the same belief as them. And then I also was thinking about chosen families and just what is Jesus really saying here?
That is a great question. Shaniqua, let me back away from the question just a little bit, because I think sometimes we ask the question, what is Jesus really saying here? I don't mean to say you're asking this, but sometimes we feel like, okay, there's some one thing that we got to get to there. But we might ask, what is Jesus saying to us here? Like, where does this meet us? Where does it meet our congregation right now? And let me propose one possibility, or actually I'll propose two. One of them is that this word that Jesus uses, hate, the Greek word, I'm a Greek professor, the Greek word miso means to hate, yes, but it also means to have less preference for, or to set kind of in a lower space. And one of the things that we try to do with our church land is to think, how is it that we have adopted a view of what that land ought to look like that doesn't come from the gospel, that doesn't come from the heart of the scriptures or from where we think that God has led us, but it actually comes from economic values that we've inherited from our grandparents and from our community and from European roots, that maybe it's time to put those on a lower place, those values, I mean, and consider, why is it that we didn't like the native grasses and we chose to import other grasses that look like a golf course rather than the grasses that actually nourish the land? Why is it that we don't like tall flowers and we want flowers that we can control? And are there ways in which we have actually shown preference for our own dominion rather than preference for the beautiful ways that God has exercised dominion by even allowing wild things to grow, or things to grow that are beautiful in ways that we can't see yet? Pardon me for talking so much. That's one thing that I'll propose. Here's a second thing that I'll propose, and I'm going to talk about this as from my perspective as perhaps the whitest man in the room, whitest and straightest. I want to propose a couple of books for congregations, or maybe for congregations, maybe for clergy, you decide, that might help you to feel uncomfortable as they help me to feel uncomfortable. I'll start with this one right here, A Little Queer Natural History. A Little Queer Natural History is a book that I find really interesting and in some ways really uncomfortable because it challenges a lot of the notions about nature and gender and sexuality and family and heritage that I grew up with and that I thought were normal and natural. Shaniqua, you know this. I study bivalves, mussels, oysters, clams, etc. You know, a lot of them change their sex throughout their lives. For instance, born male and become female. And lots of other species do this sort of thing as well. Feminism in the Wild, another book. This one is probably not maybe these ones are good for your congregation, maybe not. You have to decide as clergy, but I'll recommend this to clergy. Feminism in the Wild is the subtitle, How Human Biases Shape Our Understanding of Animal Behavior. And it's about the way that our language has shaped our science. We sometimes talk about science as though it were a simple and clear authority, but it's actually been shaped by the language that we use to talk about it. Think about, for instance, the way that so many academic scientists, my class, my guild, if you will talk about indigenous science as though it were not science. And say, well, that's just sort of folk knowledge or something like that. And then they'll go on to discover, and I use scare quotes, to discover something that indigenous people have known for millennia, since time immemorial, right? And let me throw out one more. So this is written by Moira Villiard, who is she's a Bush Fellow. She's a brilliant artist. So Ishkode, it's a story of fire. This is a children's book that tries to reintroduce children, in particular children from the tribes around Minnesota, to their language and to the story of fire. This is just one of hundreds of books out there, and none of them get any real press because, you know, they're I guess they're not the sort of thing that the New York Times bestseller list is going to sell. I think that taking the time to read books like that are different from the books we had in seminary, that maybe make us a little bit uncomfortable, can allow us to, like I was talking about with mosquitoes before, recognize that we've got a lot of biases that feel normal and natural, but that maybe are actual sort of limitations on what we've been allowing ourselves to perceive in the world.
I don't think, David, that's too far off of actually the gospel question about the word hate, right? Because it is the context in which we build our responses and our ways of looking at things. I certainly read this gospel and thought immediately of the relevance of discernment, right? Of trying to make decisions. You don't build a tower first without estimating the cost. For creation care should not be making decisions about how and what happens in creation without realizing that it is going to impact the 7 generations behind us. When you talk about the feminine spirit, particularly that comes out of our native traditions, many of us matriarchal in our ways, and the nurturing that we associate our Mother Earth with as the feminine spirit. And certainly, knowing that God created all things and it was God's feminine spirit that is infused into creation, into the earth, and that's why we call her mother. That I think about how we would never even imagine going out to collect medicines, for instance, in our tradition, and take the last of something. You always take just what you need and not more. And if there's only one plant there, you don't go to that plant. And even when we do take, we always give first. We give first, give water, give tobacco. We say thank you. We ask permission for those things to come with us. That word hate is kind of a discerning word, but it's a context word, right? That comes out of somebody's frame of looking at a particular issue. And in this case, Jesus's frame around the issue in front of him. We're all doing it. Our context, all of us, informs how we decide those things.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, that framework of understanding that word hate as being about lack of less prioritized is really helpful to me, because when I was thinking about this gospel, I was thinking about the invitation or the necessity to reconsider what we're going to prioritize, and really what we're willing to let go of our sense of what's important in order to follow Jesus. And so that idea of prioritization, or I like, Debbie, you offered discernment, feels so important to this. I was thinking about if you were sort of preaching a climate change or a creation care sermon about this gospel, one of the easy sort of places that you might go is to think about the cost of discipleship as it relates to creation. And a piece of that is what people are being asked to give up in order to take action to care for God's creation. And I think there's a lot of important pieces there in terms of giving up our ways of living that are wasteful, that contribute to climate change and pollution, giving up our practices of amassing wealth and even land, David, as you were talking about, of buying or taking more than we need and exploiting other people. But I wanted to add that I think that framework is missing if we're not also thinking about the positive side of, okay, we're giving things up, but what are we taking on? What is our positive sense of discipleship? And maybe even uplifting stories of people in your community who are caring for God's creation or working towards justice, and that giving up is only sort of a piece of the larger work of taking on the work of discipleship as well. So uplifting those success stories or those people who are embodying that kind of courage as well as the giving up.
Yeah,
Maybe I can tack on something. Oh, please go ahead, Debbie.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, I wanted to tack on something to what both of you just said, and that is that Jesus doesn't say you can't be my disciple if you're not willing to give up your husband. To put it differently, he's talking to people who are male and male-centric and trying to be dominators. You don't go and build a tower, he says. Well, who builds a tower? This is a military leader. He says, what king would go out to war without counting the costs? He doesn't even talk about queens here, by the way. He's talking to very specific people. And there's probably something quiet and unspoken there. You can imagine Jesus kind of turning to his mother at that point, kind of giving her a wink and a nod and saying, yeah, just watch the guy squirm here. But he is addressing some very male things. And Debbie and Phoebe, you both just called this out. And I think it needs to be highlighted here. The kinds of things he's asking us to give up have to do with us acting in a dominating way.
Well, I think that's interesting that we're actually even talking about giving up, because I think that's oftentimes, in the phrase that's used in the gospel about carrying the cross is about somehow giving up. But I wonder about that when we preach that, or when we talk with our congregations or our communities about giving up and how resistant they become. But instead to talk about privilege comes with responsibilities, which is the way our elders taught that to us, not that we needed to sacrifice or that we were not permitted a certain thing to go past a certain line, but to say that anything that we do have comes with responsibility and comes with accountability, right? And when we're talking about creation care, I mean, this is a perfect example. And, that's why I thought about collecting medicines. That you can't, have the privilege of using the medicines without thinking about the future, and that's the responsibility and the accountability that goes alongside the taking of the medicine or the using of the medicine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking, Debbie, about a lot of times, like Westerners always think of the I have rights idea. And as Indigenous people, we often think of the I have responsibilities. Like I belong to a community and therefore I have responsibilities versus I belong to a community and therefore I have rights. And kind of what is our responsibility as a member of the community?
Right. You're so
right. Another book right here.
Yes.
The Service Berry. Who's not familiar with it. Yeah. I mean, this is The Service Berry, Robin Wall-Kimmerer's book. It's a short read. So if you're clergy and you're thinking about the things that Debbie and Shaniqua have just talked about, let me recommend it. It's summed up on the back, all flourishing is mutual. But I mean, it's a beautiful book, and I think it could help to think about these very same things you're talking about.
Yeah, I loved the emphasis on gift giving and a sort of a deep sort of spiritual practice of gift giving in that book, David. And it also reminded me of the sort of gift of studying nature and the many gifts that offers, including understanding, mutual flourishing. And David, I loved earlier you were talking about another gift that studying nature can give us, which is a diversity of gender and sex and all the many ways that that's expressed in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nature is weird and wonderful.
So we've sort of talked about this a little bit, but Jesus kind of talking about the cost of discipleship, and we talked a little bit about the reward of discipleship. But what do you think is the cost and the reward as it relates to creation? What might be the reward be to follow Jesus as it relates to creation, and what might the cost be?
I think the first thing that I think about is our Mother Earth is not an endless supplier of blessing, right? There's a limit. And when we think about her and calling her our mother, think about our own mothers or you yourself being a mother. It's not an endless well to tap into, that we have to take care of it. And that's the cost of being a mom, of course, is knowing also how to replenish ourselves, right? How to take care of ourselves so that there is more for whoever follows. That was like the very first thing. I think it's appropriate for us to ask that question anytime that we're talking about creation or the cost of caring for creation. I think we also have to ask, what's the real reward, right? What's the real reward? Yeah.
I love what you said, Debbie. It made me think of this could be a whole sermon on self-care, right? Like if we deplete Mother Earth when there's nothing left, you can't do anything. And just like we need to make sure that we practice our own self-care so that we don't deplete so there's still stuff left, right? And that's, wow.
Right.
Thank you. So let's talk about Deuteronomy. This one I have a lot of struggle with the Old Testament pieces. In some ways, it sort of blames the victims of disasters, like X disaster happened because the community affected wasn't following God. And often we know that folks most affected by disasters are the ones with the least amount of power to change it. How might we change this narrative? Or what might be another way of lifting up this passage in a way that brings good news?
If I may, let me go back to something I was saying before when we were talking about the gospel. We could ask, what does this mean? As though there were some singular meaning, singular message that we're to get from it. If we could just wring the passage out, we'd get a few drops in a bowl and those would be the essence of it. But this is part of a story of a family that dates back thousands of years. And one of the things that we have in the canon of our scriptures is the unfolding of that story. And that story is not just about one community being always right. In fact, we know that story is often about how that community is wrong. I mean, if we were to leap ahead to the scriptures, think about the number of times that Peter winds up putting his foot in his mouth.
Right.
Think about the number of times that the community of Israel or that the early church winds up doing something where they aren't really sure what they're doing. I mean, the Acts of the Apostles, trying to figure things out. We have lots of stories of us messing up, but Genesis, just the first dozen chapters are replete with stories about how we mess up. And so often the stories that we have that come after that are stories of God's grace, meeting us in places where you could almost imagine a God saying, well, this is going to be a mess, but they've got to learn somehow. Let's walk them through this. And you could look at the story of Deuteronomy as a story that advocates conquest and advocates colonization and advocates destruction of enemies. It has been looked at that way repeatedly. And I think that it's often looked at that way by people who are about to build a tower or kings who are about to go off to war and are counting up their troops.
Right.
But consider that. Jesus, when he talks about a king who's about to go off to war, counting up his troops, we should remember that David got in trouble for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
David himself, one of the great kings of Israel, said, I'm thinking about going off to war, but let's count up the troops first. We remember that the birth of Jesus is prefaced by a census on the Romans' part, which is the same thing. They want to know how many soldiers do we have potentially that we can draft? What's our tax base? And all of those are decisions that we make when we say, rather than trusting in God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, I will trust in the things that I can count and possess and dominate. So we could look at this story that we have in Deuteronomy 30 as being God reminding the people of Israel, you're going to be tempted to count and possess and dominate. But you should remember that you should love the Lord your God. You should obey the Lord your God. Not you should obey your whims and your desires. You should make sure that you build the buildings that are going to look really cool, et cetera, et cetera. When Jesus' disciples say, look at these great stones, Jesus says, yeah, those stones are all going to fall down. That's not what it's about.
Well, I have to tell you, I think it's really sad that Scripture would include these kinds of passages that do hint at the validity of dominating and displacing people in a land for whatever reason, right? Because they have and they can be used. Certainly, we could turn that around, right? Everybody has the opportunity to see things from that perspective. That's kind of the false prophet kind of thing, where you get sort of wooed into thinking that this is a good thing rather than for it to just be really downright, named that this is the basis for colonization. This is the basis for the doctrine of discovery. This is the basis for the laws that are currently still in place. This is the basis for saying we can put people behind a wall, or we can build, a community called a reserve or a reservation, right? That's where certain people live. That we, those are the scripture passages that are actually foundational to those principles. And for us not to name, that is the message here, is that we have to recognize that our history is all not clean and pretty, and maybe whatever the relationship was of the indigenous people of that land and their relationship with God, however they did interpret the conquesting and taking of land as somehow a privilege that was theirs because they were God's people, and that gave them the right to do that. I have a really hard time even imagining that God would have seen that as good in any context.
Right. I like to wonder what the Canaanites would say. Like, what would their scripture say, the Canaanites? And that might be an interesting preaching idea, is to preach from the Canaanite perspective and to see how that, I wonder what that would sound like and how they would.
I think it's very interesting too, Shaniqua, that this Old Testament passage, the response to it is Psalm 1. Right, that is so lovingly, around Like they are like trees planted in streams of water, bearing fruit in due season, with leaves that do not wither. Everything they shall do shall prosper. It's like the nourishment or the replenishment, right, of the taking away of land is then complemented with the taking care of and giving back to.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that it's paired with Philemon, where Paul says, you could regard yourselves as having the right to make slaves of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But is that really what Christ calls us to do? Paul's calling out, just as you're saying, Debbie, I think rightly, Paul's calling out our temptation to possess and dominate. For what end?
Yeah, and how is that peace with creation, right? When we're talking about what does peace with creation look like, feel like, mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, and everything you've been sharing just affirms for me the way that telling the truth about the past is such an important piece of caring for God's creation and understanding what's happening today with our environment and climate change, whether that's everything you were saying, Debbie, about the doctrine of discovery and the uses of Christianity for harm, for colonization. But all of that needs to be a part of the way that we think about creation care. I think we're doing book recommendations today, so I just wanted to add that this Deuteronomy passage around choose life so that you and your descendants may live reminds me of We and Our Children May Live, Following Jesus and Confronting the Climate Crisis, which is a book that came out recently by Sarah Augustine and Sherry Hostetler, who are the co-directors of the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. And that book is really a deep dive into understanding the intersections between colonization and climate change and a path forward towards safety for our children. I think these passages do remind me of what our tradition offers us in being able to name things that are choosing life and things that are against life. And I think in this moment, as we're watching environmental laws dismantled, threats to clean water and clean air, the kinds of climate disasters that we've been seeing, that being able to name like actions that people in power are taking that go against life versus actions that we can do to affirm and protect life. I think that's an important framing in this time.
Well, that was such a perfect example too, Phoebe. I was going to say that too, and to point out that Sarah's first book, The Land Is Not Empty, really this is kind of, the next stage. Okay, so that our children may live. I've been blessed to be able to be serving as the chaplain for the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. And the conversations that they have in that book and the ones that are clearly part of our work groups and what we're trying to do as a whole, what our mission statement is, right, is really important. I think it's a perfect referral for people who are putting together sermons for these readings.
Yeah, and at a time when the political discourse so often is about making sure that we don't say bad things, making sure that we only say things that make us sound great, we have the liberty and the grace in the gospel to say we have sinned in thought, word, and deed by things we have done and things we have left undone. I mean, if we don't say that, we're failing. We're failing to do what we ought to be doing. That's part of the good news is the bad news. We've messed up.
And I think also too, David, which is important, to acknowledge, yes, the wrongdoing. And like Phoebe said, be the truth tellers, but also for us to recognize that unless we do that as a church, those people who have been marginalized by the church, those people who have been minimized by the church are only going to hear once again that the church is somehow thinking that it is better than and has the right to be able to marginalize and to disinclude. To marginalize and even, take, I would say, even more steps towards disassociation, right?
Yeah.
With folks. We have to be truth tellers. If we don't do that, we're not modeling the principles that actually are behind this.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about third spaces earlier today. That idea that you got the first space is the space where you live, the second space is the space where you work, if you're blessed to have those two things. And for most of us, we need a third space. For some of us, it's It's a coffee shop, and for some people, it's a favorite place in the outdoors or a city park or something like that. I was thinking about this in part because so much of the rhetoric that I hear, even in my own city lately, is about who should be excluded from those third spaces. My city has talked about not wanting panhandlers, not wanting grifters, not wanting people, et cetera, et cetera. All the unwelcome people in those third spaces, like our public sidewalks and street corners and parks. You think about the way that we build park benches with intentional aggression and hostility towards people. There's one street corner in my city where they took away this flat space and they put jagged rocks so that people couldn't sit down. There's lots of ways that we do that. And if we are blessed with a church building, if we are blessed with church land, gardens, etc., we should make those free third spaces for people. And along with that, maybe hate and despise our preferences for how they get used and how they look.
Wow. David, you're making me think about a whole sermon about the sin of hostile architecture. So I love
right. Yeah.
I think there's so much there. And when people ask, I think for some people, they're like, what does creation care, what does the season of creation have to do with, our call to support the most vulnerable? And that's exactly it, right? The way that our whole society is built and set up, and the way that space is designed, and our sense of who deserves to be where, and all of that.
I'm thinking about Philemon. And one of the questions I had was, in the letter, Paul's asking for Philemon to see Onesimus not as his slave, but rather as his sibling. Who right now do we see as a slave and really ought to be seeing as a sibling? And I think that sort of answered that question a little bit. I know I won't say who, but I got called to like an elected leader in the city's office as one of the people he wanted to have work on something. And he literally started the sentence, "What are we going to do about the Indian problem?" He didn't get the whole word problem out of his mouth, but he got the first syllable, and then he caught himself and stopped. And I was just shocked. And I was like, first of all, those are the people that were here.
Did you say, let's start there?
Right. I was trying to be nice because it's the first time I ever got called into his office. And so I was like, I should try and be a little bit nice, but I was ready. And then I was like, I think he wanted our church to take up a lot. There's a lot of homeless folks in Sioux Falls, many of whom are Native. And that's what he's actually talking about. But it's like he wants us to take on the whole thing. I'm like, the church doesn't have that kind of money. Look at the city you have. You have all kind of money. Why aren't you doing something about it? It wouldn't be that expensive to take it on. And then you wouldn't have to deal with, quote unquote, the Indian problem. It's so annoying. But who other do we see as a slave and maybe ought to see as a sibling?
Well, I think that, we're not only just talking about people of color, right? We're also talking about the folks who are really struggling because economically they've been, they're completely inadequately paid or reimbursed working. They can't afford a house, let alone to have an apartment or a room in a place, right? That it's gotten so ridiculously expensive. You're talking about people who are out there, you call them panhandlers, but people who wouldn't eat if they didn't get help from somebody else, because where else is that resource going to come from? I think about the folks who have mental issues where the healthcare system is now taking more and more away from who is qualified. If you're expecting somebody who has challenges mentally to be able to be in a work environment, provide so many hours of work justified to be able to receive health benefits. It's like really and truly we're building, like you said, Phoebe, the hostile structures to keep people in that place. And then, we make it even more miserable for them. In Arizona, we're talking about 110-degree heat for people who are living on the street. And the streets, if you're talking about cement and asphalt, if they're anywhere near cement and asphalt, you can up that another 10 or 15 degrees at least. And imagine, we know, at least from my own nursing background, I can tell you a person is not going to live in 125-degree heat for very long. The body cannot adjust itself to be able to tolerate that. So, we talk about the marginalized and how impacted they are with climate change, with the environmental injustices, These things are all related one to the other.
Yeah, that's exactly where my mind went as well, Debbie, is right, people impacted by extreme heat, whether that be farm workers, construction workers, all kinds of low-wage workers who often don't have a lot of control over the conditions on which they're working. Other forms of modern-day slavery, like people who are incarcerated and then are being used for labor in that way.
Mm-hmm.
One of the lessons I've learned from the Poor People's Campaign and the work of the Cairo Center, which I think really fits with this vision of people that we see as a slave ought to be seen as a sibling, is actually seeing the leadership of those people, whether that's farm workers, labor organizers, poor people organizers, and seeking ways to follow the leadership of these people who are fighting for better conditions, not only to see them as the victims of these systems, but really as the places where transformation and organizing and change is possible. And then I also thought of another idea about who we see as a slave and could see as a sibling, which is the many animals that are tied up in our food system. This is maybe a little bit more out there, but I was thinking about bees and other pollinators, thinking about cows and pigs and chickens that we eat for meat. Our system sees these animals as just sort of labor and outputs that can be used for our food. But I think a truer understanding of them would be as siblings or partners in the web of life who we rely on to eat and for our existence, and that could be a place to pray and preach and think about the transformation of our food system.
And maybe even to be discerning about how much we take, right? That maybe we don't need as much as we think that we do. Yeah.
Yeah. Those who are just listening won't be able to see this, but I'll describe what I'm holding up. I'm holding up two mussel shells. So these were freshwater mussels, and they've got holes drilled in them about the size of a shirt button. And the reason for that is they were used as shirt buttons. And we eliminated mussels from most of the rivers in the United States, eliminated or severely impaired them because we couldn't imagine what use we could make of them. Often when I tell people that I study freshwater mussels, the first question they ask is, can you eat them? I mean, we tend to think like that, like it's useful if I can get some gain from it. As it turns out, some of those mussels could filter 25 gallons of water a day. So that was useful, but they were invisible to us. We chose not to see them. And so we thought, well, they're free, and so I can just take them and turn them into shirt buttons. And Shaniqua, your question, who do we see as slaves? I think probably many of us, if you ask it in that way, will say, oh, obviously no one. We did away with slavery back in the 1860s, right? But that name, Onesimus, and in Philemon, his name means useful. Philemon means one who is affectionate, one who has philia, the same root as Philadelphia and philanthropy, one who loves. And Paul might be playing with their names a little bit there and saying, your name calls you someone who is affectionate as a friend. His name calls him someone useful, but I want you to live into your name and stop making him live into his. I think we might not think about other people, or as Phoebe was pointing out, other species or ecosystems, or as we sometimes call them, natural resources, which I think is a terrible phrase, as slaves, but we think of them as useful. We think of soil only in as much as we can get something from it. Water, useful, only in as much as we can get something from it. And we sometimes forget to cherish. To go back to your original question, Shaniqua, the one you opened us with, if a church is new to celebrating the season of creation care, what might they do? One of the things that we might do is consider incorporating practices of delight and not just practices of usefulness, but find something around you and take time to delight in it and to give thanks for it and to ask, what don't I yet understand about it? What can our congregation do to increase our understanding about it? What does it need from us? What does the soil need from us? What do the bees, not just the honeybees, which are not native to North America, but the hundreds of species of native bees? And again, if you can see, I've got a poster on my wall back there that's all the backyard bees of North America. There are hundreds of species of bees native to North America. Most of them are solitary bees. Most of them don't sting us. Most of them are pollinators that are necessary for certain flowers, and they don't seem useful to us. The world is full of wonderful things. And some of those bees are so small that if they landed on the eye of a bumblebee, they wouldn't cover the entire eye, which means you and I probably never see it. What it's a bee out there that is finding flowers and has a relationship with particular flowers that are small enough that that bee can get in there and get to the pollen. And the big bees can't, so that flower and that bee need each other. Isn't nature wonderful? Maybe that's a place to start.
I think that's really connected also to your the idea of where do you find home and taking pictures. That's a place where we can begin with awe and wonder, because there are homes for not only humans but for everything, for all the things all around the earth. What is their home?
Yeah.
We might ask, is there anything in creation that makes God say ick? Is there anything that God thinks of as icky and gross and doesn't belong?
Mosquitoes.
And other than mosquitoes and freshwater mussels and a handful of other things, bugs, obviously. But I mean, if we affirm that everything was made by God and that God did this creation as an act of love and it's beautiful, then if we find things icky in it, whether those are species of insects or invertebrates or other people who don't look like us, smell like us, act like us, love like us, maybe, just maybe, there's something wonderful and beautiful for which we should be giving thanks and about which we should be asking, what is it that God loves in these people, in this ecosystem, in these species that we as a church have failed to see so far? And how can we repent of that and devote ourselves to learning? I sometimes feel like Shaniqua was never going to invite me back because I just get on these like philosophical rants that are sort of like half natural history and half sermons.
That's why we love bringing you, because of the creation care episodes you do. This is where you shine, David. I'm wondering if Paul were writing a letter to the church about the season of creation or our church's relationship with creation, what might be something that Paul would say?
I want to take something from Act 17. I realize it's not one of our readings for today, but in Act 17, we watch Paul go into the marketplace in Athens and try to explain the gospel in terms that are familiar to him and no one understands him. They even call him a country bumpkin, spermologos in Greek, a seed picker. And then he goes up onto Mars Hill, the Areopagus, and he tries again. And this time he quotes the indigenous prophets and they understand him. Maybe Paul would write something like that to us today and say, the wisdom, the knowledge is already mostly there. Maybe you haven't heard the name Jesus yet, because that's a Hebrew name from far away, but the rest of it, you get the big picture. Let me tie these together for you.
I'm thinking about Paul in terms of, he's always beginning his letters with where he's coming from, right? That this particular one, he's in prison, and what the prison term gives him the freedom to be thinking about out there. And so often his letters are about not only calling out the things that people are not doing correctly, but also sharing a lot of love and affection, and beginning with love and affection. I know that we are talking about the Deuteronomy lesson rather than the Jeremiah lesson, but it's complemented by Psalm 139. And I think about, Paul using that kind of language to invite us into being aware of the wonder of who we are and what wonder and awe, like you said, David, is out there in creation, and inviting us to pay attention to that. And maybe even if he's calling us out in today's terms on something, I see that there's, at least from my perspective and my context, it's like Native voices rising. It started, I think, way back, of course, with the AIM movement, but certainly when the Dakota Access Pipeline started, it really banded a lot of us together to be able to pay attention to things that we're talking about, environmental injustices. And I think Paul would be writing a letter and talking about, the folks who went in the encampment for how long and suffered through the ways in which they were treated. And, even though they were not successful necessarily in stopping the pipeline, it brought attention, it brought strength and leadership out for others. Certainly, I look at it now in terms of our current struggle with Oak Flat, for instance, and trying to really pay attention here that the only reason that Oak Flat, a sacred site where for centuries and millennia, young women's coming of age ceremony has taken place, that was put at risk so that the Resolution Mine Company can come in there and mine the copper. Why? Because it was attached to a must-pass defense bill. And it was just a land swap. And I think Paul would be calling out the people who made that swap, and that for us to think about whether that was right in the first place, right? To sneak it in on something that had to happen. Those kinds of things, I think, are the things that we'd be hearing from Paul. But it's always balanced with this, think about the love and the care and the affection that comes from Paul to those he addresses first. He always says, I'm coming to you with a loving voice, first and foremost.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about Paul's messages moving across space and calling and telling the story of people in a particular place. And, I too have been thinking so much about Oak Flat and the struggle of Apache Stronghold to protect that sacred land. And there are people from all across the country gathered there right now. And these are crucial weeks for that fight. Your words about Paul made me think about a really lovely 15-minute video that the Season of Creation organizing committee put out when they announced the theme, Peace with Creation. And it has little brief messages, or you could think of them as letters from people in different places, including Archbishop Hossam Noam of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem. And another message that I wanted to just speak briefly about, which is a message from the Pacific Conference of Churches in the Pacific Islands.
Yeah.
A leader there, the Pacific Islands have been so devastated by climate change and so exemplify this place of injustice of the people who have contributed the least to the causes of climate change being impacted first and worst in many cases. But they put out a beautiful message from that area, specifically about one of the actions or the campaigns of the Season of Creation, which is talking about the ways that the countries that are most responsible are also involved in holding poor and developing countries in debt, and that the release of debt is a crucial part of climate action. And there's so much here if you haven't thought about or learned about this before, but often countries will be impacted by some sort of a climate disaster, a flood or a drought, and will be forced to take on debt to developing countries. And so it keeps the flow of money actually going from developing countries to developed countries. And it's a major site of injustice, and it's holding us back as a global community and taking more action on climate change. So I think, as well as all of the local actions that David has been encouraging us to do in the Season of Creation, this could be a time to receive a letter from Oak Flat or from the Pacific or from another part of the world, and to learn about and pray about and be in solidarity with someone else. And I think that this call for debt relief is a really important part of the Season of Creation this year.
Yeah, and Phoebe, you made me think of another book that I would recommend, and that is Caitlin Curtis's book, Living Resistance, because it is really and truly talking with us about how we have to live resistance in the world where those kinds of things that, forgiving debt is the only way, really, that there's going to be any transformation. For us to be able to live that resistance, it certainly follows with what we're doing with the things like Oak Flat and with Dapple and with other climate areas. Alaska, the impact of Alaska, the earthquakes, the volcanoes that are erupting at this point in time, all of the kinds of symbols and signs that we are getting that there's problems, right? There's trouble in paradise. Yeah.
I was thinking about Paul talking about how we spend our energy and resources. And Phoebe, you hit on that really well. I was thinking in our churches, 90% of the money our churches have on average, we spend on ourselves. Like, we don't spend it going out and doing the work of ministry. And that's so unfortunate. And I think he might say that. How much of our energy and resources are we spending out to do the work of the gospel, helping to be the church and be the gospel for others rather than spending it on our own building or whatever? But those roofs need to be replaced and anyway, let me get off that topic. Last question. What tips do you have for preaching for 18?
I have to go back, Shaniqua, to what you just said, because I think it is ironic that the church does this, right? And yet one of our principal stewardship things is, to talk about where your money is or where your heart is in your pocketbook.
Yes.
We see where you're spending your money. Here we say this, right, for stewardship campaigns, and we ourselves are the ones who are doing it as well. So sorry, I had to just throw that little irony in there.
Absolutely.
I think with preaching in general right now, it's such a challenging season in our country and beyond. And I think that finding ways to preach messages of hope without turning away from the suffering of the world and modeling how people can embody hope and see signs of life and transformation, but in a way that doesn't involve kind of turning our eyes from suffering or turning our eyes from places of harm. So any way you can do that, I think, is really powerful right now.
I'm going to recommend one more book. This is Matthew Dickerson, Birds in the Sky, Fish in the Sea, Attending to Creation with Delight and Wonder. I would look for ways to attend to creation with delight and wonder. And Dickerson's book is itself just a work of beautiful art, both visual and in words. It's gorgeous. But what Phoebe is saying, I think, is spot on. I work with mostly 18 to 22-year-olds at the university, and I find that generation is really experiencing climate anxiety and dread and despair about the future in ways that my generation and older generations are not. My generation is thinking about how are we going to retire? What's going to happen if, when we think about, if we're thinking about climate concerns, we're thinking about what's it going to do to our retirement funds, that sort of thing. Those are all legitimate concerns, but we need to be pointing people back to the wonder of creation, to the delight in knowing a God who has made this place and called us to tend it and steward it, and has given us this reciprocal relationship with it.
I don't know if everybody else lost David, but I lost him in that. I didn't get to hear what you had to say.
It records natively onto the laptop, and then it'll come up. So even though he froze for a second, we'll get the whole thing, and we'll cut this little conversation we just had.
Well, you're talking about preaching for proper 18, but I'm thinking about, in broad terms, like David and Phoebe, about preaching of creation care during that season, in spite of whatever the lectionary readings are. Certainly you can weave lectionary readings into almost everything. But honestly, I think people are not as impacted by words when it comes to creation care. And I think, David, the whole theme of with awe and wonder, there are lots of ways for us to bring visual, to bring video, to bring music, to bring, articles, to bring all those kinds of things into our preaching during this period of time. It's probably one of the only times you would ever hear me say, let's put a video camera or a TV in the church and watch something together. But I do think that it's important for us not to use words, because I think people don't have a tendency to connect at the heart level as much with words, unless there's a strong connection in the community. Whereas if you show them pictures, if you show them videos, if you make real the environment around them, and I'm not talking about videos of something that's on the other side of the world, because that's another form of detachment, right? Well, that's over there, not here. I'm talking about doing it very much in its context of where the church is.
Yeah, that's right. When God became incarnate, he became incarnate in this world, in a particular place with particular species around and particular ecosystem and particular delights. I'd recommend Anyone listening to this, if you don't have the iNaturalist or Seek app on your phone, and if you don't have the Merlin Bird ID app on your phone, get them and just start playing with them. And that will help you to do just the very thing that Debbie has just talked about. You'll start to discover stuff around you that you didn't even know was there.
Merlin Bird app has brought me a lot of joy this summer. So I second that recommendation. You can record audio. If you see something quickly and don't get a photo, it can help you figure out what it might have been.
Yeah.
And speaking of animals, it's, we're talking about the first Sunday in the season of creation, but I just want to mention the last Sunday in the season of creation, or the last day, which is October 4th, the Feast of St. Francis. And it's not too early to start thinking about whether you're going to do a blessing of the animals or a pet blessing. I think that's a beautiful way to bring visuals, like you were saying, Debbie, to bring creatures into your congregation or to incorporate them in some way. And it's always a beautiful opportunity to then broaden our frame of who we're praying for and with to broader sections, whether that's all of the creatures in your ecosystem, whether that's thinking about farm and garden ministry. So just to broaden our sense of St. Francis as we're planning for that holiday this year.
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely say preach on the gospel just because it has that problematic text. And if you skip over it, people might get the wrong idea. So definitely touch on it, or at least explain some ideas of what it could mean. I love the idea of discernment and talking about preference one over the other. Anyway, thank you so much for being willing to be guests on the podcast. It's been great talking and listening and learning from you. I know I get so much out of this, and I know our listeners do too. Thank you.
It was fabulous being with all of you guys too. I feel blessed and honored and humbled.
If you want to learn more about Beloved Community, visit episcopalchurch.org/beloved-community. If you want to learn more about creation care, visit episcopalchurch.org/creation-care. Thanks to our guests, Phoebe, Debbie, and David. Thanks also to our production team, especially Mike and Chris. If we planted a seed in your heart, please rate, review, and of course, share our podcast. Until next time, let your light shine.